Ishun. If that name means nothing to you, it should, because geographically, it's one of the single most important pieces of ground Russia controls in this entire war. It's the narrow land corridor connecting occupied Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland. The choke point, nearly everything supplying Russian forces on the southern front has to pass through. Overnight, Ukraine struck a Russian supply depot sitting right there, and that wasn't the only target hit in the same operation. A river crossing Russia relies on to move personnel, weapons, and supplies. Drone command posts destroyed in 4 separate locations across 3 different regions. Stay with me, because this wasn't a random collection of strikes. It was a coordinated push against the specific choke points Russia depends on to keep its southern front fed and functioning. My name is Ben Hodges. I spent close to 3 decades in uniform, and if there's one principle that holds true across every war I've ever studied, it's that geography doesn't change, no matter how sophisticated the weapons get. A narrow land corridor is a narrow land corridor whether you're talking about this war or any war in history, and controlling or denying that corridor still shapes everything downstream from it. Quick thing before I get into it, if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because I break down exactly this kind of logistics-focused strike as it happens. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I always like seeing how far this channel reaches. Now, let's get into what actually happened. In this video, I'm walking you through the strike on the Ishun supply depot, the river crossing hit in the same operation, the wider sweep of drone command posts taken out across multiple regions, and why choking off logistics choke points like these matters as much as any single dramatic refinery fire this channel has covered. Let's start with the primary target. On the night of August 5th, and in the day before it, Ukraine's defense forces struck a depot of Russian military supplies located in Ishun, in annexed Crimea, according to Ukraine's general staff. Ishun sits at the narrowest point connecting the Crimean peninsula to the Ukrainian mainland, historically and militarily the single most important land route in and out of Crimea. Every truck, every convoy, every shipment of ammunition, fuel, or equipment moving by land between Russian-controlled southern Ukraine and Crimea has to pass through this exact corridor, or one very close to it. A supply depot positioned at Ishun isn't just another warehouse. It's forward-staged inventory sitting at the exact geographic bottleneck Russia depends on to keep its forces in Crimea and along the southern front resupplied without relying entirely on longer, more exposed sea routes across the Black Sea or the Kerch Strait Bridge that this channel has covered, coming under repeated strikes throughout this war. It's also worth noting that this operation ran across a span of hours described as both the night of August 5th and the day before it, meaning this wasn't a single tightly clustered nighttime raid, but a sustained push across a more extended window. Further evidence that Ukraine's strike apparatus can now sustain coordinated pressure across multiple target categories and multiple regions for longer than a single overnight strike package typically allows. Now let's talk about the other target hit in that same operation, because it complements the Ishun strike in a way that tells you this was a deliberately coordinated push against logistics infrastructure specifically. Ukrainian forces also struck a crossing over the Mokri Yaly River near the settlement of Vesele in Donetsk region. According to Ukraine's general staff, Russia used this specific crossing for military logistics, moving personnel, weapons, and supplies across it. A river crossing serves the same basic strategic function as a land corridor like Ishun. It's a geographic pinch point that concentrates traffic through a single controllable location, which makes it simultaneously essential to the side using it and highly valuable to the side trying to disrupt it. Hitting a supply depot at one critical choke point and a river crossing at another in the same overnight window reflects a targeting philosophy built around denying Russia the physical geography its logistics network depends on, not just destroying individual pieces of equipment or inventory wherever they happen to be parked. Let me pause here and give you the analysis, because I think logistics choke point strikes like these deserve more attention than they typically get relative to more dramatic targets like refineries or air bases. A refinery fire makes for compelling footage and a clear headline number: barrels per day lost, percentage of capacity offline. A depot or a river crossing doesn't offer that same clean statistic, but the operational effect can be just as significant, sometimes more so. Destroying inventory sitting at a choke point doesn't just remove that specific shipment of supplies, it forces everything behind it in the supply chain to either wait for the choke point to reopen or attempt a longer, more exposed alternate route that itself becomes a target. When you understand Crimea's geography, a peninsula connected to the mainland by a small number of narrow corridors and one heavily contested bridge, you understand why a strike at Ishun specifically threatens to bottleneck resupply for the entire southern Russian force posture, not just whatever inventory happened to be stored at that one depot on that one night. I want to spend a moment on why Ishun specifically carries this much historical and strategic weight, because it's not a name that comes up often in mainstream coverage of this war, even though it should. Ishun and the narrow isthmus surrounding it have been a decisive military choke point for the Crimean Peninsula for centuries, going back to campaigns fought there long before this current war began, precisely because there simply aren't many ways to move a large volume of personnel and material onto or off of Crimea by land. In the modern context of this war, that same geographic reality means Russia's entire southern force posture, everything supporting operations in occupied Kherson, the defense of Crimea itself, and the broader southern axis of this conflict, depends heavily on keeping this narrow corridor open and functioning. This channel has already covered the sustained pressure Ukraine has placed on the Kerch Strait Bridge, the other major connective link to Crimea, throughout this war. Ishun represents the equivalent pressure point on the land side of that same equation, and a depot positioned there specifically is positioned to feed forces on the Crimean side of that isthmus with exactly the kind of forward-stage supplies that make the corridor useful in the first place. There's also a useful comparison here to the artillery repair base strike near Novaya this channel covered recently, because both strikes reflect the same underlying targeting philosophy applied to different categories of infrastructure. Where that earlier strike went after the capacity to repair and sustain existing equipment, this operation goes after the capacity to physically move new supplies to where they're needed in the first place. Repair infrastructure and supply choke points are two different links in the same overall logistics chain, and Ukraine's sustained campaign throughout this year has increasingly gone after both simultaneously, rather than focusing narrowly on just one category of target. A military that can't easily repair its damaged equipment and simultaneously struggles to move fresh supplies through its most critical choke points is facing compounding pressure from two directions at once, each making the other problem worse. Now let's widen the lens, because these two choke point strikes were part of a broader operation that same period, one that specifically targeted Russian drone command infrastructure across multiple regions simultaneously. Ukrainian troops struck Russian drone command posts in several locations at once, in Mali Sherbaki in Zaporizhzhia region, in Kostiantynivka and Chasiv Yar in Donetsk region, in Zelen Pole also in Donetsk region, and in Volfino, inside Russia's own Kursk region. Separately, Ukrainian forces struck another Russian command post near Bakhmut in Donetsk region. That's 5 separate command post strikes, spread across 2 Ukrainian regions under partial Russian occupation and 1 region inside Russia itself, all executed as part of the same broader push. Drone command posts coordinate the exact reconnaissance and strike drones Russia uses to target Ukrainian positions along the front line, meaning this wasn't purely a logistics operation. It combined choke point strikes against physical supply infrastructure with a parallel campaign against the command nodes directing Russia's own drone warfare capability. It's worth spending a moment on why drone command posts specifically have become such a consistent target category across this operation and others this channel has covered. A drone command post isn't just a location where operators sit, it's typically where reconnaissance feeds get processed, targeting decisions get made, and strike drone operations get coordinated across a given sector of the front. Destroying a single drone doesn't meaningfully degrade an adversary's broader drone warfare capability. There are simply too many individual drones in circulation on both sides of this war for any one loss to matter much. But destroying the command post, coordinating dozens or hundreds of drone missions across an entire sector, has a genuinely outsized effect, because it disrupts the coordination and targeting intelligence layer that makes those individual drones effective in the first place, rather than just removing one piece of hardware from an enormous and easily replaceable inventory. I want to place this inside the broader statistical picture Ukraine's own leadership has been providing about the toll this kind of sustained pressure is taking. On August 4th, President Zelensky stated in his evening address that over the course of July, Ukraine's defense forces had killed or seriously wounded more than 30,000 Russian soldiers using drones alone. According to Zelensky, that trend along the front lines has remained consistent, repeating itself on a similar scale nearly every month. Whatever your read on the precision of that specific figure, and Ukrainian casualty claims about Russian losses always deserve some healthy skepticism, given they come from one side of an active war, the broader trend it reflects lines up with everything else this channel has documented: an increasingly sophisticated, drone-centric Ukrainian campaign that's degrading Russian capability across multiple layers simultaneously: personnel losses at the front, command and control infrastructure behind it, and now the physical logistics chokepoints connecting the two. The Kursk region command post strike specifically deserves a separate mention, because it's a reminder that this operation wasn't confined to occupied Ukrainian territory or Crimea. Volfino sits inside Russia's own internationally recognized borders, and a Ukrainian strike reaching a drone command post there, in the same overnight operation as strikes on occupied Crimean and Donetsk targets, tells you this campaign draws no meaningful distinction between occupied Ukrainian land and Russian sovereign territory when it comes to targeting the infrastructure directly supporting operations against Ukraine. That's consistent with the broader pattern this channel has documented all year: refineries, air bases, and now command posts, deep inside Russia proper, are treated as legitimate military targets whenever they're assessed to be directly supporting the war effort against Ukraine. Let me also be fair and note the other side of this exchange, because honest analysis on this channel always means acknowledging this remains an active two-way war. In the same window as these Ukrainian strikes, Russia's Tula region came under a separate Ukrainian attack that ignited a massive fire at a Wildberries logistics facility, continuing the pattern this channel has tracked extensively already. And Russia's own strikes against Ukraine continued at their usual intense pace during this same period. This channel has consistently noted the scale of ongoing Russian missile and drone bombardment against Ukrainian cities running in parallel with every one of these Ukrainian deep strike operations. Neither side has paused its own offensive operations to conduct these campaigns. They're running simultaneously, which is worth remembering every time a single night's Ukrainian strikes get covered without that broader context. I also want to explain why river crossings specifically function as such high-value logistics targets, because it's a category of infrastructure that's easy to overlook compared to something as visually dramatic as an airbase or refinery. Building a functional military crossing capable of handling heavy vehicles, armor, and sustained logistics traffic isn't something that gets improvised overnight. It requires either an intact existing bridge or the kind of engineering assets and time needed to construct a pontoon or temporary crossing capable of bearing that weight repeatedly. When Ukraine destroys a crossing like the one at Vesele over the Mokri Yaly River, Russian forces don't simply find another bridge nearby and continue operations uninterrupted. They either have to divert traffic to a more distant crossing point, adding time and exposure to every single logistics run along that route, or commit scarce combat engineering resources to rebuilding a functional replacement under conditions where Ukrainian reconnaissance has already demonstrated it can locate and strike that exact location once already. Let me be fair here about what remains genuinely uncertain. We don't have a detailed public damage assessment on exactly how much supply inventory was destroyed at the Ishun depot, or how long that specific choke points disruption actually lasted before Russia found alternate routing or repaired whatever infrastructure was damaged. Russia's defense ministry, predictably, hasn't offered any detailed accounting of the losses at either Ishun or the Mokri Yaly crossing, and we don't know with certainty how much operational disruption the 5 separate drone command post strikes actually caused to Russia's broader drone targeting capability along the front, versus how quickly those command functions were simply relocated or restored elsewhere. Let me bring this together and give you the strategic assessment as I see it. On the night of August 5th, Ukraine struck a Russian supply depot at Ishun, sitting directly on the narrow land corridor connecting occupied Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland. In the same operation that hit a military logistics crossing over the Mokri Yaly River in Donetsk region and destroyed drone command posts in 5 separate locations spanning Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Russia's own Kursk region. That combination, choke point infrastructure on one side, command and control nodes on the other, reflects a deliberately layered approach to degrading Russia's ability to both supply and coordinate its forces along the southern and eastern front simultaneously. It landed inside a month President Zelensky has described as continuing a sustained trend of over 30,000 Russian casualties from drone operations alone, a scale of pressure this channel has watched compound month after month across every category of target we've covered this year. Watch whether Russia attempts to establish alternate supply routing around the Ishun corridor, because a peninsula this dependent on a narrow set of physical connections to the mainland has genuinely limited options for rerouting logistics traffic if this specific choke point keeps coming under repeated pressure. Watch whether Ukraine returns to strike the Mokri Yaly crossing or similar river crossings elsewhere along the front, because targeting the physical connective infrastructure of Russia's logistics network, rather than just the depots and vehicles using it, is a more geographically constrained target category that Russia has genuinely limited ability to simply relocate. Watch whether this kind of combined choke point and command post operation becomes a repeatable monthly template, because pairing supply corridor strikes with drone command post strikes in the same operation appears designed to degrade both what Russia can move and what Russia can coordinate at the same time, a harder problem for defenders to solve than either pressure applied on its own. And watch whether the drone command post strikes across this many simultaneous locations become a more regular monthly pattern, because a coordinated push against command infrastructure spanning 3 separate regions in a single operation suggests Ukraine's targeting intelligence for locating these nodes has matured considerably over the course of this year. This has been Hodges. Stay informed, and I'll see you with the next update.